My name is Jake, welcome to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk about investing in the world's 5 greatest challenges. The world has always been faced with issues and challenges throughout time. If you were to go back 100 years ago and ask someone what were the greatest challenges facing the world then, you would get a very different answer than you would if you were to ask somebody today. And I would go so far as to say that if you were to ask somebody 100 years from now, what are the greatest challenges that the world is facing? I would go out on a limb and say that you're probably going to get a different answer. The longer that I invest and the more experience that I have with investing, the more I realize and understand how little I actually know, and how this has really persuaded me to really focus heavier on index investing. That's why I love the core and satellite approach to investing, where about 70 or 80% of your core portfolio is in high quality dividend growth ETFs. And then if you have individual companies, they're just satellite positions and they make up a very small position in your overall portfolio. I remember back on a quote from Warren Buffett where he was talking about if you're going to invest in individual stocks, he said, if you aren't willing to own a stock for 10 years, don't even think about owning it for 10 minutes. Now, this is very challenging because the world is always changing. What's interesting today, what's working today, may not work in the future. And it's very difficult to predict and to be agile and flexible to get in and out of an investment if you're investing into individual stocks. Now, this advice from Warren Buffett can sometimes be very difficult to follow because there's a lot of noise in the media and there's a lot of influencers out there that claim to know what the next big thing is. But deep down, they themselves have no clue what tomorrow looks like, let alone 10 years into the future. But they'll still give their predictions and they'll still make their strong claims. And you know, it kind of looks a little like this.
I'm going to tell you a secret about everyone else's job.
Okay.
No one knows what they're doing. I don't know how to run an animal control department. Half the documents I get, I put right into the shredder because they're so boring.
But you seem like you do know what you're doing.
Yeah, I seem like it. Deep down, everyone is just faking it until they figure it out.
Oh my gosh. If you invest in the world's problems, there's always going to be a demand or a need for that service, okay, or product, right? And so I was thinking to myself, what are the biggest issues facing the world today? And, you know, there's very common things where, you know, we look at different areas of the world, what's challenging in some areas may not be challenging or an issue in others. And I think, you know, this list that you're going to see here on different websites is going to change over time, as it has always changed over time, as the world evolves. Now, before I go into detail into the 5 challenges facing the world today as I see it, I want to start by saying that I'm not going to be able to cover every issue, every challenge that the world is facing. Okay, and by not including it in this list does not mean that I'm discounting that challenge. What I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to accomplish with talking about this and creating this video is I want you to think in a different way. I want you to think in a different way than what the media is telling you, what you're seeing on social media, what your friends are always talking about. I really want to bring it a step back, and I really want to focus on the core essential pieces to human life. And that is how I came up with this list. Now, I want you to imagine for a second that you're on a deserted island and you're all alone. What are the first things that you're going to look for in order to survive being on a desert island? The very first thing that you're going to do is you're going to want to look for things that are going to help you to survive, okay? And the very first thing is you're probably going to look for a source of water. You're going to look for water, you're going to look for food, you're going to look for shelter, you're going to look for some sort of energy, maybe to start a fire so that you can cook that food. And then lastly, you're going to look for protection. Now, there may be a lion or some predator out there that's looking to do harm to you, so you're going to need protection. Now, I want to talk about each one of these individually for just a moment. So let's first start off with water. Not everyone in the world has access to clean, fresh water. Some areas the water is filtered, some areas it's not. In some parts of the world, individuals have to go and travel for many hours to be able to get a source of fresh water. So in order to tackle this challenge, there are a lot of companies out there already that are addressing this issue. And this could be in the form of transportation of water. This could be in the form of filtration, so that every individual on this planet can have access to clean and fresh water. Now moving on, when we look at food, this is a very complex topic, because when we think about it, in North America where I live, I think the food is very, very accessible, very readily accessible. However, the quality of the food is not always the greatest. When I was living in Europe, there's different regulation. Countries and governments view regulation on food very differently. And then you go and you look at other areas of the world, there's very limited access to food. And this has to do with many different things. And so companies that are addressing this challenge, whether it's growing it, transporting it, distributing it, the land that it grows on, there's definitely a market, a need for food. And the lack of food in some areas is a major issue, even if it's not something that you're dealing with where you currently live. Now moving on, when we look at shelter, this is a very broad topic. There are many different ways that companies can address and solve this challenge that we have around shelter. And the topic of shelter is very different depending on where you're at. In some areas of the world, it's very accessible, very readily available. In other areas, it's not. There are certain companies that are addressing this head on. You have home builders directly, you have contractors, you have companies that are material companies that are building the materials and producing the materials for the buildings, for the construction of buildings. Now moving on to the topic of energy, this is similar when it comes to shelter, where across the globe, there's different needs. When it comes to the topic of energy, it could be in the form of a utility company offering energy or gases to residents in that area. It could be transporting the energy to different areas of need. Having energy is a fundamental need, and there are companies out there that are addressing this need, and you as an investor, you could invest into those businesses. Now, the last one here is protection or defense. And I think this is a little bit more of a sensitive topic, and I want to make sure that I'm very clear with what I mean here. So I used the example earlier with the deserted island and how that there's predators out there. Those are individuals or things that want to do harm to you, right? Or to human beings. And there's companies out there to protect and to prevent that from happening. And that's what I'm talking about. And there's very, very many different ways that a company can invest in the protection of human beings. That can be in intelligence, that can be in machinery. There's many different ways, but despite being a little bit more of a sensitive topic, it is a fundamental challenge that the world faces today that needs to be addressed. Now, in each 5 of these areas, you can invest into individual companies, or you can invest into ETFs that cover these specific topics. You can invest into a water ETF. You can invest into a food and agriculture ETF. You can invest in a home builder ETF. You can invest into a utility or an energy ETF or index, right? And you can also invest into an index that focuses on companies around defense. So these are all areas that you can invest in, and I want to share with you an example of a way that you can look at this. So if you wanted to invest in one of these topics, what you could do is you could take a look at ETFs that are focused on one of these topics. For example, you could look at the ticker PHO. This is the Invesco Water Resources ETF. Now you're going to want to obviously make sure that the expense ratio is not too high. You want to look at other metrics that are, important to you. But the most important thing is, for example, that you want to look at is the holdings and what the holding breakdown looks like. This is really a great way to continue to do research and understand, okay, if I invest into a water ETF, what does that mean? What type of companies are held in an ETF like this? Okay. And for example, in this one, you're going to get utility companies, industrial companies, healthcare companies. And then what you'll want to do is you want to look at the top 10 holdings. And why this is so great is you're not going to know a lot of these companies. A lot of these companies are going to be B2B. They're not consumer facing. And so if you did want to invest in the individual companies, this is a great way to start doing research to learn about what are the companies out there that are addressing these issues, these challenges that the world faces when it comes to, for example, water. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's different ways that companies can tackle this topic. For example, with Ecolab is a great example. They are really great at water treatment, water filtration. A lot of different business units within this company deal with water. So that's one example. Another example is you could invest into a company like American Waterworks. This is a company that's raised its dividend, and they are actually a utility. They get water to residents, to individuals in their home, okay? And I forgot to mention as well with Ecolab is a dividend aristocrat. They've increased their dividend for over 25 years. Another example that you could use is A.O. Smith. A.O. Smith is a water heater company. They're in the Midwest here in the United States. They service a very large percentage of the United States households with water boilers, right? And so if you're wanting to take a warm shower, well, A.O. Smith you probably have a water heater from A.O. Smith. So this is an example of how you could invest in the topic that we just talked about when it comes to the challenge of water. So let's take a look at one example. Let's take a look at American States Water Company, AWR. This company was founded in the 1920s. It is a regulated utility. So very similar to other utility companies like for example, Southern Company. If we look at the dividend history here and the dividend metrics, you can see that it has a fairly low dividend yield, starting dividend yield. So just right around the S&P 500. But the thing is they've raised their dividend for the last 19 years, and they have a 5-year 9% dividend CAGR. This is really, really strong. And so if you go in here and you take a look at their dividend yield, you can see that their average dividend yield for the last 4 years has been just around 1.5%. Now, this is the really cool thing that I want to highlight. If you go under the yield on cost, if you would have bought AWR 10 years ago, you would have right around a 6% yield on cost on that initial purchase 10 years ago. So this is very much a dividend growth company. So next what I want to do is I want to take a look at the historical performance compared to, for example, the S&P 500. Now I want you to bear in mind that this is a regulated utility that deals with water. We're not talking about selling iPhones or software or Tesla cars, right? We're talking about water. All right. So over the last 10 years, the price return of AWR versus the S&P 500. Now, this is just the price return. If we look with the dividend reinvested, it's doubled what the S&P 500 has done over the last 10 years. So this is the S&P 500, but what if we were to take kind of the holy grail of dividend ETFs, and what would it look like when you would compare it to SCHD? Comparing to SCHD, AWR has greatly outperformed both the S&P 500 and SCHD on a total return basis. So that being with the capital appreciation and the dividend reinvested. Now, I'm not here to say that the next 10 years will be the exact same, but it's really interesting to see that the world is facing fundamental challenges. And companies, businesses that are addressing these challenges, I believe will benefit not only in the short term, but also well into the future for the long term. And as I always mention, when you think about, companies like this, in my opinion, if you wanted to invest in companies that are making the world a better place, this may be a great option for a satellite position. This may be an option to add, 1 or 2 or 3% as a satellite position for your portfolio. But obviously, in my opinion, it's always best to keep your core with index funds, okay? But AWR, in my opinion, might make a great satellite position, and I could absolutely see myself in the future adding a company like AWR to my portfolio as a satellite position. But of course, it wouldn't make up more than 5% of my overall portfolio. When you think about creating generational wealth, in my opinion, there's no better way than to invest into businesses that have a competitive advantage or that are solving one of the world's greatest challenges, whether that be a water company, a company that focuses on food or distribution or protection or shelter, but understanding and thinking in a different way and not just thinking about today. What are the biggest challenges facing the world today, but what are the challenges facing the world decades into the future? And in my opinion, that is how your average person can be successful in creating generational wealth for you and your family for generations to come. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope that the video was helpful. I hope that you learned something new. I hope that this opened your eyes to a new way of thinking, and I'll catch everybody in next week's video.
Please subscribe. Please subscribe.
You know what? I think we're gonna be friends. Can everyone say hi to my friend? That's crazy. I just wanted to say thanks. I'm glad you came along, partner.